Hi, good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Bridget Chan. I'm the program manager for the Share the Mic in Cyber Fellowship at New America. And I'm very excited that you are joining us this morning for a fireside chat with Nicole Tisdale on cyber insecurity in 2024. I also have the great pleasure right now to welcome our second cohort of Share the Mic in Cyber Fellows who are at this conference room table with us. And so we are welcoming you to join in the conversation with the Q&A at the end. So to frame this whole event, if you have been keeping a pulse on all things cyber in 2023, you'll know that last year was fairly eventful. A few highlights include the release of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the proliferation of generative AI products and services, emerging conversations about data governance and privacy, and just increased ransomware attacks. 2024 promises to be just as, if not more, intense. The 2024 presidential elections will be happening in November. There's a predicted rise in AI-enabled cyber attacks, and intensifying efforts to fill the cybersecurity workforce gap are among some of the things that we can anticipate in an otherwise unpredictable year. So Nicole will be in conversation with Sam Sabin of Axios to help us make sense of what we can realistically, or what will realistically be the most consequential issues on the horizon impacting our nation, and issues that she has her eye on in 2024. So now I'm going to hand the mic over to Sam. You Bridget. Okay.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Sam Sabin. Super jazzed to be able to actually meet Nicole in person for the first time and talk with her and pick her brain. We spent like 10 minutes learning about Nicole's routine and life, and I'm like already impressed and overwhelmed and feel ill-equipped to do this, but we're gonna see what happens in the next hour. So I guess maybe to get the conversation started, Nicole, before we look forward, let's set the stage. Looking back at the last year, and I know we're only like 3 weeks into the new year, and maybe perspectives will change as we get more time, but for now, what were maybe some of the big trends and yeah, I guess big trends of 2023 that you noticed, saw, and think are going to be meaningful heading into the new year?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank everybody for joining us. I'm very excited to be able to kind of sit and have this conversation. I think we all know at the beginning of every year, you have all these people that kind of like lay out their predictions for 2024, whatever the new year is going to hold. But I love that we're here with the research community, with the data collecting community, to talk about our priorities, because I think sometimes in civil society, the priorities are a little bit different than they may be for government actors and for the private sector. So I'm very excited about today. I'm also a fan of Sam. I've been slightly stalking her lightly on the internet because I also think you do such a great job at these talks and bringing cyber down into a space where it's inclusive for everybody, no matter their background. So that being said, I'm going to do the thing and say, well, this is what I thought was the biggest thing in 2023. I think taking from 2023, I thought we saw cybersecurity really be a model in effective governing. And so bear with me. I think when you see in terms of the strategies that were rolled out, so you see the White House Office of the National Cyber Director rolled out not just their national cybersecurity strategy, but also their education and workforce strategy. We were also in a place of, and I think about when you think about what a strategy is, the White House also rolled out their artificial intelligence, all of that, those strategies, those are plans, those are roadmaps. So that is the administration and the executive branch saying, this is where we want to go. And we want to make sure private sector knows this is the roadmap, this is what we're going to do. But also to Congress, it's a signaling to Congress. These are the areas that we are going to be doing our policymaking in. And so as you're thinking about where you're going to do lawmaking, this is, if at all possible where we should coordinate and where we should be on the same page. I also think it's a really good signal to civil society, because civil society gets to act as an advocate in a very different way of shaping what those priorities should be, and then also being a voice for what types, or being a voice for groups that may not have been included. And so I thought also so you had the strategies coming out, and then you also saw a lot of implementation. So I'm quite the fan of Congress. People know this. I worked there for a decade. And so I remember a lot of people saying, well, we need Congress to do something on AI. We need Congress to do something on AI. And I'm like, wait, Congress needs to be deliberative. And Congress is doing a lot on AI. We don't always need a piece of legislation. And I think it's important sometimes to just stop, get a lay of the land, give advocates time to participate in the lawmaking process. And I also would remind people is Congress did a lot of work on cybersecurity in the previous year. And so you saw cyber incident reporting became law. Congress has given the agencies time to come up with their rulemaking process. So now that we know that all critical infrastructure owners and operators have to report major cyber incidents, what does that look like? What data do we need to collect? How quickly do we need to get that data? And then kind of what our response is. Congress also got to see the fruits of their labor in the rollout of the cybersecurity grant program. So that was $1 billion that Congress appropriated in 2022. And so you saw that money start to actually hit the communities that are going to be using it. And so when you put all of that together, I'm biased because I like cyber, but I thought that was a really good model of this is what effective governing looks like. When you add to the piece of not just what we've been doing domestically, but what we've done internationally. And so you see, we have the ransomware, the global ransomware task force, but also, we now have a UN working group discussing cyber norms and like being very public about it and it being part of a mainstream conversation in a way that it hasn't been. And so I hope I make the case of like, when I say effective governing, I think all of this showed a level of coordination as we are all trying to move toward resilience in cyber.
Totally. And I think it's a fair point, right? I think a lot of people maybe in Silicon Valley, in tech industry, people in news, myself included, want things to like move fast. And that is not what government does by just the nature of it should not move fast, right? Like you don't want a new law every 2 minutes and then like have back and forth and all of this like compliance and la-di-da. So I think it makes a lot of sense, right? It is effective, even if it's piecemeal, we're learning, we're figuring it out. There are all these moving pieces. You kind of are just shoving everything through the door, and it's a lot of stuff. I do wonder though, in the last year, if there's anything in that these roadmaps and these implementation strategies, in the actual implementation of the grants, if there were any like big trends or big questions that you think started to arise that will end up being a theme throughout 2024 or anything, lessons learned from the past year or anything like that?
Yeah, I think the big question, and one of the things that we'll get into this a little bit more, I think we're going to have to be a lot more aggressive when it comes to deterrence, right? So as we've been seeing these attacks increase, and whether that's the use of more tailored phishing attempts that lead to data breaches, there are all these signals that it's more and more is happening. The attacks are happening. The attack surface is getting larger. They're happening at a scale. And I think timing is always really, really important. And I think we are at a time where we have got to start back having policy discussions about deterrence. Mm-hmm. We cannot always be in this reactive space. I would also say defense is great, but defense without deterrence just means you're in this constant battle. And so I always joke with people about cyber incident reporting. I'm like, that is the piece of legislation that I spent my entire career working on. But it's because the timing wasn't always there so that people could say, wait a minute, why don't we have mandatory cyber incident reporting? And I always tell people it was really colonial pipeline for the cyber community. And I always caution cyber experts who are like, well, it was just a bad cyber hygiene. I'm like, no, that puts cybersecurity as a kitchen table issue in a way that it had not, right? So that was at a time where people are now saying, well, what is ransomware? What is a cyber attack? Why is it impacting my ability to buy gas? There was also an influence operation where it was like, actually, it's not impacting your ability to go buy gas. We're just all making a run on the gas stations, and our global supply chain is not set up that way. But for us, and I was in the White House at the time, that got me to the top of the congressional agenda. That got us to the top of the press cycle so that we could say, hey, y'all, we really do want to make some improvements on cybersecurity. And one of them is where we start with, we need people to report these cyber attacks when they happen. And most of the public did not realize that that was a requirement, it wasn't a requirement, right? And so I was able to do in 8 months what I could not do in 10 years on the field because it was a timing issue. Yeah. And I think as we see these attacks on our healthcare, like nothing is off guard anymore, right? Schools can be attacked, hospitals can be attacked, our wastewater and our water, drinking supplies, all of these things can be attacked. So if nothing is off limits, when do we have this conversation about deterrence? So that's the big question. I know there's like a few pieces of legislation, and of course, Congress consistently is having like hearings where they're talking about this. The White House has mentions of it, but I would love to see in 2024 that we, especially civil society, start to get to the table and say, all right, what are we going to do about cyber norms? What are we going to do about deterrence? And what are we going to do about penalties?
Totally. And when you're talking about deterrence, is it basically like having that cyber plan, knowing what to do? I know it's everyone's favorite phrase. So is it stuff like that, or what? Certain people mean different things like deterrence. So
yes, I will say, I mean, I do have a national security background and I have worked in intelligence. I think all things should be on the table, but I would caution people against having that as like the answer. That's not deterrent. That's, to me, deterrence is a toolbox, and you have multiple tools in the toolbox. Deterrence can also include attribution. Deterrence can also include declassification of information. How much information do we share with the public? How quickly can we give attribution? Who did this? What methods did they use? That all of that stuff is a part of deterrence. And so I'm sure we have people tuned in and are like, Nicole's all for having that. I'm like, that is not what I'm saying. I'm also not taking it off the table, but we need more tools in the toolbox.
Amazing. Okay. And it's things like sanctions, it's those court orders, it's all that stuff, not just get your computers ready and let's get after them, I guess.
Yes. I mean, that is a thing in the community. And I always warn, there are multiple things when we talk about deterrence, right? And so I'm thinking about this from the policymaking space of on the Hill, and when we're at the White House, I've heard a lot of the arguments of, well, if we set up cyber norms, only the good guys are going to follow the cyber norms. And I would say, well, right now, only the good guys are following the cyber norms. And so us not having the norms is not stopping the attacks. And so we have to have a full conversation. And it's a conversation that we cannot have without civil society being at the table, because I think we have to have more than just the cyber community and the national security, the traditional national security community at the table. Like, we need to have the human rights advocates. We need to have people with healthcare backgrounds, all this. As we set this up, we need to make sure these are going to be rules of the road that everyone can follow and everyone can be included in.
Totally. And perhaps this is one of these themes, but as promised, we're going to look ahead to 2024. I promise we're not just going to talk about the past. Heading into 2024, what are maybe your top 3 things that you think the community needs to be talking more about, focused on? So I think there are more than 3. I feel like 3. I don't want to limit your creativity and your thought process, but what are maybe those 3 items? And it's okay to deterrence one of them as well.
Well, so for 2024, the thing that I'm going to be working on is how cyber operations, not just attacks, but cyber operations impact marginalized communities and vulnerable communities. And so for me, when I think about the top three things, they all fall under that umbrella. So I'm really interested and focused on what we are going to do about AI-enabled cyber attacks. And I'm interested in election security. And I'm also interested in international coordination, all under that umbrella of protecting marginalized groups and our most vulnerable populations. When I say AI-enabled attacks, I think as everyone rolled out their articles about the biggest hacks of 2023, what became clear to me is there are groups that are not at the policymaking table because they have like traditionally just not been included in a national security conversation. So when we hear that the supplemental food program suffered their cards that they use to pay out for food assistance to vulnerable groups had a major cyber attack in 2020. And you saw the policymakers kind of be in a response mode where it's like, okay, so we are realizing now that those cards don't have traditional fraud protection. So just because someone steals your money from the public food assistance program doesn't mean that you can call the 1-800 number and the money will be put back on the card like your credit card. And so you saw Congress very quickly get a supplemental in place so that you could recover some of the funds, but you could only recover 2 months of the funds. And so you have people who are already on the margins of society, right? They need assistance, and that is low-income families, that's natural disaster victims, that's our military veterans and their families. It's also our Asian population. They cannot sustain a cyber attack that takes away 2 months, 1 month, 3 months of their benefits. And so when I think about that, we don't normally, USDA runs the food assistance program. USDA's cyber division is at the cyber policymaking table, but not the benefits, right? And so when I learned, I didn't know that the card didn't have traditional fraud protection. They have to be sitting at the table when we're having these discussions. Because, and we can't have Congress always being in a place of saying, okay, this happened, so now we're going to try to give an influx of cash. It takes a long time to do that, and also you can't recoup everything that you've lost. That's just not an effective way to do policymaking. So when I think about AI-enabled attacks, I'm thinking about those people who are not at the table. When we talk about election security, I think the cyber community has done a really good job in terms of getting ready for 2024 elections, not just in the United States, but also in the global community. And so when we think about it, I see a lot of assistance and work being provided to our election critical infrastructure and the people who support that work. I think you also see civil society has a little bit of muscle memory, and so we know how to physically protect people from intimidation at the polls, but also in the lead up. The area that it seems like we do not have a private sector focus and civil society is trying to wrap their arms around it are protecting the most vulnerable groups from the influence operation. And when I say influence operations, it's less about who you're going to vote for. It is really depressing and suppressing people's belief in democracy as a whole. And when you talk about marginalized communities, it impacts them in a very different way, because democracy is the only way they can address some of these systematic issues of racism and classism and sexism. And so telling people that democracy isn't working, they shouldn't vote, nothing is going to change, that is impactful in a very different way. And when we see now, we're seeing state actors have gotten into this. And now they have cyber tools that they can use to do this at scale, and it's relentless. And it is tailored to these communities and the real grievances that they have. So when I talk about election security, if we're thinking about the 3 pillars, the physical security and then the cyber protection of the election infrastructure, I'm firmly in this 3rd tier, which is focused on cyber-enabled influence operations. And then, if it's possible to make this short at this point, just the international coordination of all of it. Yeah. I always tell people when they're like, the elections are coming, I'm like, y'all, the elections have started. This is a global election year. We're going to have 2 billion people deciding their next heads of states. this is an important election year, not just for the United States. We don't vote until November. A lot can happen between that time period with our international partners that is going to impact us in a way that includes what happens to us at the poll. But these are going to be our partners that we're going to be governing with for as long as they are in office in their respective states. And so I think we have got to, when we talk about what we're going to be doing in 2024, just making sure that our partners are at the table with us and we are in lots, because we know whatever phishing campaign happens in the United States can also happen in the UK. It can also happen in Nigeria. Whatever election security issue that happens in the United States can also happen in India. It can also happen in Southern Hemisphere countries as well.
Totally. I feel like there are 1,000 questions I can ask from those 3 buckets, and I have the impossible task of picking one, which I guess maybe what are the ramifications if we don't focus this in and think about, it seems like the overarching trend here is thinking about the impact on people and the impact especially on marginalized communities. I feel like a lot of times we're thinking policy, we're thinking businesses, we're thinking the flow of money, we're thinking trade and other impactful things that are not about the actual victims or the people who end up having to live with the circumstances of an influence operation or even like a water plant near miss. What are the ramifications if we don't center this on people, or we keep forgetting about the people in this, right? The humanity aspect of cybersecurity.
I feel like anything I say, I try not to be like a doomsday person in cyber. I feel like there are a lot of doomsday people in cyber, but what you're going to end up with is just more AI, whatever we are talking about, it just amplifies what is already there. And so if you, to the point of like what happens if we don't address this, you're creating more inequalities, you're creating more disparities that are impossible for people to overcome. If you are, I think about these attacks that have been happening on our school systems, and we don't have a lot of data for the private K-12 schools, but we have a lot of data about how much money these public K-12 schools have basically had to use to respond to cyber attacks, but also increase their cyber protections. Those schools can't get that money back. And so if they are, the money has to come from somewhere, right? Like if you need 10% more for your cyber budget, you have to take that from somewhere. And that's not something that's going to be immediate, an immediate impact on society, but that has a long-term impact on society, because that is something that is taken. Is it the after school programs? Is it the missed learning days? There are all these things that are going to impact our society as a whole. It's not, when we attack our most vulnerable and our most marginalized communities, that ripple goes throughout society and it happens long term. And so when I see these attacks on our school system, I don't think about what their response is today. I think about what these students are having, or how these students are being attacked long term. If you see a student's data has been released publicly, has been part of a data hack or identity fraud, I think about what is going to happen to that student if their credit is messed up at age 7 or 10 when it's time to apply for financial aid when they go to college. I think about what's going to happen when their employer is like, you can't get a security clearance because your credit is bad. That is what I think is the long-term issues. And like, as we're thinking about how this impacts us in the future, you can't think about the 30-day, 90-day. You need to be thinking about, what is this going to look like in 3 years? What is this going to look like in 5 years?
Totally. And then just a reminder for those here or tuning in virtually, probably in like 10 minutes or so, I'm going to take audience questions. So start thinking about them, start submitting them. Please submit questions. I mean, I can keep talking forever, but and so maybe to switch gears a little, you very clearly have a lot of government experience, whether it's in the administration or Congress. And of course, ever since Colonial Pipeline, it's felt like there's been like a sea change in even what cyber policy looks like, how it's structured, how it's governed in the US. I would love to hear a little bit about how you're kind of viewing everyone's roles and how they've shifted in recent years, and where potentially we can keep strengthening or building upon the changes that have happened in the last 3 years now.
Yeah, I do think DC has become, especially when we talk about cyber policy, I think we've become much more inclusive of the groups that need to be at the policy table. It is not lost on me that we are here today with the Share the Mic in Cyber Fellows, who are also part of the Cyber Civil Defense, where we have all of these nonprofits who have very focused areas that they are working on in cybersecurity. And you have, I would joke with people, I'm like, we have everything from cyber education and awareness with Girl Scouts to the think tanks of the world, like the Institute for Security and Technology or the Aspen Institute. But then we also have Shadow Server, who is also providing technical assistance to the federal government. And so when I say the cyber civil defense, I'm like, yeah, you can join if you're 3 all the way up until at this point, until you expire. And so I think that is a really good example. It has not always been like that, y'all. Like there was a time when I was on the Hill where when we would work on legislation, we really had to be very intentional about getting civil society groups to come and sit at the table. I remember the first conversations we were having, we were trying to decide, what are we going to do on encryption? Are we going to legislate on encryption? Where are we going to require it? And we were inundated with people from Silicon Valley, literally to the extreme, y'all. If you come in, you either love it or you hate it. But then we also had everyone coming in from the executive branch. Most of them hated it. And I just remember saying, like, we've got to get some more players at this table because, yes, like the private sector can provide good information and they can help with policymaking, but their mission is just very different, right? Same thing with the federal partners. Their mission, the FBI has a very specific mission that impacts how they feel about encryption. Having civil society at the table really does give you kind of like the best of both worlds. And so when I think about how the roles have shifted, I'm excited to see where we have organizations like CISA I'm trying not to use so many acronyms in 2024 when I talk about cyber. The Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, but then also the National Security Agency. They have these partnership programs that we are now talking through. Do we need to codify these in law? And I tell people, I'm like, y'all, that's just not where this town was on both sides, right? The private sector is like, do not put in law that we will be a part of a public-private partnership. But also the agencies are like, we don't know if we're going to keep this up. This might just be something that the current wants to do. I think that is a significant shift, and I'm very proud of the cyber community to say, no, we need these partnerships. We need to make sure that they are set in statute because it doesn't matter who's leading an organization. These are important. And we want to maintain these relationships. And so I'm very excited about that change in roles and participation.
Totally. I feel like you mentioned codification of those programs. I feel like the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, that's like what they're all about. And probably someone from Senator King's office is here listening and it's like, thank you. But I mean, I guess, so we have what, the government, private sector, civil society, all kind of working together to help ensure that we have better cybersecurity, ideally. I hear a lot about what we're doing better. Where are places where we can improve and keep improving?
Yeah. It's so funny that you brought up the Cyber Solarium Commission. Because, and I want to be clear before I say this, the Solarium Commission gave us great recommendations. I think the majority of them have now been codified in some type of form. But the one thing the cyber community is starting to scare me a little bit. And I can't figure out, I mean, we've seen this in writing and I've seen like a couple of think tanks like socialize this. This whole idea that we need to streamline all of the cyber jurisdiction in Congress to one committee in the House and one committee in the Senate, it panics me in like a very real way, because I don't think people fully understand how many people, how many committees, how many members of Congress need to be involved in the development of cybersecurity policy. And so when you brought up the commission, I know that was one of their recommendations. And even when I was at the White House, I dealt with a couple of people being like, it's just too much cyber jurisdiction on here. Every committee has cyber jurisdiction. And I would remind them that every agency also has cyber jurisdiction. Are we going to, we just talked about the impact of the food assistance program with USDA. I don't want USDA to not be a part of the cybersecurity community. When we talk about what happened in 2022, we also had the attack on JBS, which is a meat processing plant. USDA was at the front of that conversation. I don't think we should take cyber jurisdiction away from USDA. That also means we don't take it away from the Ag Committee in the House, and we don't take it away from the Ag Committee in the Senate. I think as a cyber community, it's a little bit of a red herring. I would encourage us to move past that because that is not what inclusive cybersecurity is, nor should we concentrate power into a single committee in the House and a single committee on the Senate. We're just not going to have a whole of society viewpoint when we're pushing what will be the only legislation that works on these issues.
Totally. It's almost like we prepared this because that feeds so nicely into my next question. So jurisdiction really confuses me sometimes. Admittedly, it's been several years covering this fee, and it makes sense, right? If you know, a farm or a manufacturing plant is hit, I understand that, you know, the sector specific agency needs to be involved in some way, shape, or form. But I do wonder, there's been so much shifting and changing in terms of who has jurisdiction, which offices even exist. We're talking like the Office of the National Cyber Director is only what, like 2-ish years old, maybe 3. Math is hard when you're in a new year. But you know, I do wonder if you feel like it's clear still who does what and for what purpose, and if we can be doing a better job of signaling why we have to have all these people at the table involved in discussing these things.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I can only imagine, like, I want you to feel confident. I still have to like sit back and be like, wait a minute, this particular issue in the House, what committee is it? In the Senate, what committee? And look, when I was at the White House, I was Director of Legislative Affairs. A lot of my time was spent talking to the agencies to be like, no, we're not going to go to House Homeland Security Committee for that. We need to go to the House Energy and Commerce Committee for that. I would say 2 things on that. First, I think as we got to give ourselves a little bit of grace because we're trying to figure this out. The Office of the National Cyber Director, I think, is a really good example. That is governing at its best, where Congress has said, we want this office to exist at the White House. It has been 2 years. Congress accidentally forgot to give them money the first year. So really, you know, when we talk about 2 years, it's really been about a year. And you see that they're trying to address this issue. Not only did they release their national cyber strategy, they released a national cyber implementation plan. And in that implementation plan, you can see what agency is in charge of what. I will highlight for people, you don't really see those implementation plans made public. I mean, Congress, yes, the executive branch usually shares them with Congress, but you don't see so much intention of trying to help people navigate where to go to talk about what issues and to participate in what policymaking process. I think that's an example of like, we are going to have to constantly redefine where people go, what the roles look like. But I would also, that's like kind of the first thing of, we're doing this in real time. And so it takes a little bit of time to realize that in a natural disaster, there are some things you talk to FEMA about, but there are some things FEMA at the Department of Homeland Security, but then there are also things that you need to talk to the Department of Transportation about. And at no point have we just decided that we want to do away with any role the Department of Transportation has to do with natural disaster recovery. We're going to always need those different lanes because people have different specialties. The other thing is, I don't want to spend too much time trying to figure out cyber jurisdiction on the House and the Senate. This is what I tell people. I was an attorney on a committee. There should be no issue that a member of Congress can bring to me that I cannot figure out how to write it so that it fits into my committee's jurisdiction. And that was my job. If a member of Congress tells me that they want to regulate the cybersecurity behind baby formula production, It is my job to figure out how to write a piece of legislation so that I can get that bill referred to my community. I tell people, I'm like, I use that as an example of like, you don't have to figure out jurisdiction. That is what the staffers get paid to do. And also, ultimately, the jurisdiction doesn't matter so much. It's what you want. There's any piece of legislation that you're talking about, you want it to get to the floor of the House and the Senate, and you want it to become law. Spending so much time on where it starts is probably not a good use of anyone's time, especially when you have lawyers like me who are like, I don't care where it starts. I can start it here in House Homeland on the House side. I can start it in Senate Intel. It just shifts. And when we talk, that's legislation, hearings are just completely oversight. Anyone can send a letter. And we want a Congress like that. I don't think any constituent would be happy to hear their member of Congress saying, well, I can't work on this issue for you because I'm not on that committee. Or I can't help you with this problem because that's a committee that I don't have jurisdiction over. It's just not how Congress is set up to operate. And so I will tell you, you can always ask them too, but also I wouldn't worry about the jurisdiction so much.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, like 2-ish minutes, 1 minute, oh my god, till I do audience Q&A. And of course, we're gonna squeeze in one quick question around the 2024 elections in that time. It's so simple. We have it solved, Nicole. You know, I think you were mentioning earlier the concerns that you have, and I think rightfully so, around disinformation campaigns targeting marginalized communities. It's happened in many elections before. It will undoubtedly happen again this year. It probably already is. You know, I'm curious to hear like what specific strategies you think should be implemented and pursued this year to help mitigate the impact of these campaigns as much as possible, knowing that there are so many, it's going to be impossible to squash all of them. But what ideas do you have to solve that, Nicole?
Very easy question. We have to. I really want the national security community, especially the cyber community, to stop opting out of elections. And from the outside looking in, it feels like our adversaries have figured out where our constitutional protections are, and then also how to kind of circumvent them in a way that is not about upholding constitutional rights or provisions, because a lot of these bad actors are from authoritarian governments, so they don't care about democracy. And what I think the cyber community, rightfully so, for civil liberties reasons, but also political reasons, are very hesitant to get involved in these influence operations. And what I would like for them to do is see their role as being just as much about delivering data and information as well as contextualizing this information, right? So we know that these attacks are tied to geopolitical wars, campaigns, issues that are going on throughout the world. That context matters. And what civil society is not in a place to do, because they can't see all the intelligence that is coming in and all of the information that's coming in, you can't always figure out where the next domino is going to fall. And I don't expect the national security community to become mind readers, but there are some patterns that we can see about these campaigns that are going to require more than just the general, here are the threats, these are the things that we're seeing for 2024. It's going to require a more active engagement, and I think we just don't have the muscle memory in the national security community. But that context, when I think about the intelligence reports that I've read over the years and the framing that I would draft legislation in, I always had the context all around. And I feel like a lot of the people who are going to get the influence operations, like they're going to be on the receiving end of the influence operations, they don't have the context. I think attribution is going to be very important in the elections. I am very stressed out the 30 days before every election with this kind of, I'm calling it arbitrary because this whole like unofficial dead time that we have, the 30 days before US elections, which was created in the 80s when we were mailing information to each other and picking up the phone. Yeah. I'm always like, can we please revisit this, y'all? Like I think it is dangerous, especially when people know and at the speed of information to say 30 days, we're not doing anything. A lot can happen in those 30 days in 2024 that could not happen in 19. And so really just kind of going into the elections, we need to move at the speed of these influence operations, especially the ones that are coming from state actors and state linked actors. They have so much more sophisticated technology. They can do things at scale and the tailoring of this information. I think that's really important. So easy answer. But I really want the national security community is instead of kind of having this hands-off approach of like, we will advise and share information from up here. I think it has to be consistent and it has to be more tailored to what is happening around the world to show, and this is why we're being attacked.
Totally. Okay, so we're gonna transition the audience Q&A. I don't know if anyone in the room has a question now or go ahead.
Yes, sir. Michael Regan, my question relates to something that you said. You talked about the progress over the last few years in collaboration between the government and civil society and the private sector. What are some of the barriers that you see now that need to be overcome to continue that progress over the next several years?
I think the biggest thing, and talking to civil society and also just kind of knowing where you all are going to be, I really want the research community, I want civil society to lean a little bit more into the policy making process. One of the things that I, felt it on the hill, felt it when I was at the National Security Council. A lot of civil society is still in the like venting and ranting space sometimes when they come talk to policymakers and lawmakers. And there's a place for that. And I think you should always be in a place to vent and really kind of express your grievances. But then you also have to ask for something. Like you have to give because I think of the rules of not lobbying that a lot of the nonprofit and civil society community deals with, it keeps them from advocating in a very direct way. So stating that we need to address the shortage of cybersecurity professionals is very broad. Coming in and saying, we need the government to start giving grants to nonprofits in the same way that philanthropy does, so that we can invest in the infrastructure. That is something very direct. And from a policymaker standpoint, I can do something with that is not as clear as a broad kind of remit. And so one of the things I think is being very intentional about getting into the advocacy space and being very intentional about what you're asking for and really like driving. And so like to put that in layman's terms is like, you should make a recommendation. Your white paper should have recommendations, but your white paper should have an action plan too. So these are the recommendations. Here is this, and we used to do this at the White House where it's like, we have a strategy, but we also have a legislative action plan. These are the pieces of legislation that I need you all to pass so that we can get this done. In Congress, the beginning of every year, all of the top Democrats and Republicans of every committee, they lay out their priorities. They give the roadmap of this is what we're going to be doing in cyber. If you see something on that priority list that you like or you don't like, or you want it to be a little bit more nuanced, it's your job to reach out to that committee, to reach out to those members of Congress and tell them exactly what you want to see.
I'm gonna go in order here. So you have a question from Anonymous, which is very, I love that. Drama, the intrigue. So what lessons learned from cyber incidents or breaches? What are the lessons learned from the past year from breaches, incidents that have happened that organizations maybe can start applying and helping them to rethink how they're defending their networks and things like that?
Yeah, when you said anonymous, I got worried. I tailored that not to the private company, but again, knowing who our audience is. That's smaller, and I think civil society can set the standard for this. We do not have demographics of these attacks.
Yep.
So one of the things that I was thinking about as we keep talking about the healthcare attacks, right? I love that because we're really just relying on the journalist community, our press community to like break down what that means, like show us the impact. Don't tell me a hospital in Kansas was attacked and leave it there. Right. Tell me how many patients are served by Medicaid. share the demographics. If you have the race and ethnicity, that would be great too. But I'd also love to know what the income averages are for their community. I want to know, is that a single serve healthcare facility for people in a 30-mile radius, 100-mile radius? That context is really important and it's missing right now. And I think it's because the cyber community is really focused on kind of the like TTP, the tactics, techniques, and procedures. And it's like, okay, but can we get an eye in there? Because that's the impact. Tell us the impacts. Because I think we have to start talking about these attacks in a more narrative form so that we can get the general public, again, how do we get back to the kitchen table, not from a place of fear, but a place of awareness so that people know this is happening every day, this is happening to your community. And I think that's something that's very unique that civil society can do, and especially in you all's position as fellows. That's something that you can do in your research and you set the standard and then people will start to follow.
Totally. I feel like not understanding that impact also makes it more difficult. I feel like what this question was looking for was like advice for defending your organization, which I don't patch and prioritize, but not understanding that impact also makes it difficult to provide that advice, right? Like if we don't fully know the scope of the issue or the impact of those TTPs or whatever, like I have some advice, but I don't know for sure if that's really gonna help until I know the full picture of what's going on.
Yes. And I will say too, it feels like I should do this disclaimer. I'm a part of the cyber community, but I am a part of the cyber policy community. And so if you are calling, if you want technical advice about how to protect your organization, I am not the person to call. As a matter of fact, I want you to call the right person and then you follow up with me and you're like, you know what, we needed a policy in place for this. We needed a policy in place for X, which was not the question, but I would be remiss if I didn't make that, if I didn't tie that to the cyber workforce. Because that's something that I spend a lot of time talking about. When we say we need more people in cybersecurity, we don't just need people with technical expertise in cybersecurity, right? Like I am a political science attorney. I am in cybersecurity and I have a very defined lane. It is working on public policy. That is just as important as responding to an attack because I'm over here trying to figure out how do we deter the attacks? How do we make sure that the people who are impacted by the attacks are also protected? You need people, when we say our cyber industry needs more people, we need more people everywhere. We don't just need people with technical expertise, although we do need a lot of people with technical expertise. But 2 years ago, you saw the Biden administration out of the White House was very clear saying, we need more cyber attorneys. The National Security Division of DOJ has said, we need more cyber attorneys. I feel like everybody is raising the flag of cyber attorneys and we need more people in the policymaking space. And folks are like, I'm gonna go get my certification. I'm like, okay, I want some people to go get their certification and do the technical work, but just make sure we are understanding that the cyber community involves a lot of different people that don't always just have technical expertise.
Totally. So there's any other question in the room, just raise your hand, you guys have them all, but all of these questions are from anonymous. I think it's just fun. They're really low, they're really not scary. I just think it's a funny distinction. So the next one is just as technology advances, how do you see the relationship between privacy and cybersecurity evolving? And what measures are in place to help kind of balance the two?
Yeah, this is a hot take. But when I think about privacy and cybersecurity, I think we have the tools. We've got to start socializing them with people. So when I talk about, again, y'all are gonna get tired of me talking about marginalized communities and impacts. But when I think about an attack on the healthcare system, there is the physical reaction immediately of like lost services, rescheduling appointments, all of those things. But when you think about what is being stolen, a patient's data, and that is ultimately going to be used as part of an identity fraud, that also creates an erosion of trust issue in a healthcare system. And so when you talk about communities that are already fearful about healthcare services because of past harms, you're now adding to that. And one of the things when I try to talk to communities about this, I'm like, I know you don't want to talk about encryption, but that is always a way that I enter a very technical term into a conversation about how an attack makes me feel. And so I think as we are trying to figure out how we get the attacks to stop, being realistic that we're not gonna be able to like flip a switch and no attacks will happen. How do we lessen the devastation from an attack? And I think that is a conversation about encryption. I think we have to figure out a way to standardize encryption in a way that protects student data, that protects patient data, so that it makes it less of a target to be targeted in the first place.
Totally. And then, I think the other question on a totally different topic, the election. Here we are, we're gonna solve them today. So, how has the threat landscape for election and cybersecurity evolved since 2020? And what steps should be taken to address cyber threats to electoral systems?
Well, I mean, when I first, a long time before I was doing cybersecurity and espionage policy, I used to do seaports and maritime policy. And so I always tell people, I was like in the space for 2 years and really just kind of dealing with data breaches. And I was like, oh, and then 2016 election happened. And I was one of the staffers that was in the room when the executive branch came and informed Congress that Russia was interfering with our elections. And I just remember being so angry. Like I wish I had another emotion to describe it, but I was really just angry that something like that could happen. And I remember in 2016, we were dealing with what are really major issues, but now they're so far in the review because it is a sign of success. So we know now that all of our state officials, state and local election officials, someone has a security clearance so that we can talk to you about what we're seeing in as close to real time as possible so that someone knows, even if we haven't declassified it. We're also declassifying information at a faster rate. Also, I think, that was also the year that we made election infrastructure a part of our critical infrastructure. I still feel like I'll meet people sometimes and they're like, is it still a part of our? I'm like, yes, y'all, once it's there, it's there. And that is something that sounds very technical, but saying that our election infrastructure is just as important as our healthcare infrastructure, is just as important as our communications infrastructure, that is something that is very much needed. So when you think about that, I think we made really good strides. I think in terms of the private sector commitments from Microsoft to Meta to Google, where they are saying we are going to invest in the support, the technical support, and the technical support for not only election infrastructure, but the people who use it. And we're going to invest in cyber awareness and education so that they know how to use these tools. I think that's really good. I again, as we're talking about the areas, I do think we have a long way to go in terms of cyber-enabled influence operations, but I've been very pleased. You never want improvements to come because a disaster happened, but I don't think it was a wasted disaster because we got a lot of improvements that we needed in election security. And we also just made it a part of a national dialogue and a national conversation, which I think is good.
Totally. And I think, that's good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I will bring it back to vulnerable communities, especially because I'm advisor at the Cyber Peace Institute, which focuses on the impact on vulnerable communities with cyber operations can have. So we're one of those NGOs mentioned as an example that what society sector can do in this space. So informing on the impacts and harms, etc. But in this respect, I wanted to ask you about advancing norm implementation, which you mentioned as one of the key issues for global cyber security governance, because this had been a very problematic issue in some respects, especially after 2021, which was a very successful year for both GG process and open working group process, with 2 consensus reports being agreed upon. Since then, there is this a kind of stagnation in practical implementation on a global level.
Yeah.
And countries do have problems to agree on bigger issues. We always speak about incremental progress in the negotiations, etc. And incremental progress is important, especially in the situation we are right now with the geopolitics of which is increasingly more difficult. But is there, especially with regard to vulnerable communities, is there maybe approach we could take in these platform negotiations to advance the issues as a global whole? Like, for example, one of our programs is mapping the impact on cyber attacks on healthcare sector. What does it mean for the communities? And I really liked your comment on disaggregated data and who are the communities who are impacted. So definitely we'll take it into account in our work. But is there, from your point of view, some perspective we can take to really further the protection for vulnerable groups that would be also interesting for the global communities and maybe a point of cooperation in this very difficult times in global negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complex question. I've been following the work that Cyber Peace Institute has been doing as well. This is gonna sound like the most government govy response ever, but I think that is the process, right? And so I will also say, before I say what I think we should do, I just want to remind people that we could do hard things. Like, I feel like that is, when you talk about how difficult it has been to get the international community to like coalesce and say, we are going to have norms that everybody follows. There's like one of my former coworkers at the White House has like a sign on her desk that says we can do hard things. And so it is going to be difficult, but I think the idea that we would have norms of warfare and battle for physical impacts. And we are now in a digital space, and we won't do that for digital, and we won't do that for cyber, is ridiculous, quite frankly. And I think it is a place of government is going to have to push. I don't know. Again, I don't want the private sector to start hacking back. And so I think government is going to have to set these frameworks, and then we're going to just have to do it. Someone is going to also have to go first. I think about cyber incident reporting. One of my talking points to try to get members of Congress to like support us doing it was there's only one country that has cyber incident reporting. And they were always like, what country? Is it the UK? I'm like, no, it's the People's Republic of China. And so like, we are going to have to do cyber incident reporting. And I think it was a domino effect. So you see the UK is like, and we were in talks with our partners and their parliamentarian bodies as well. We knew multiple other countries were considering cyber incident reporting. It's just no one wanted to go first, right? Like, it was like, this is gonna be taking this on is gonna be big, it's gonna be hard, people are gonna hate it, and then maybe we had got to the point where people love it, but I hope we're getting there. But someone has to go first. And I think that's what's gonna have to happen with the cyber norms. Someone is going to have to put forth the policy, and then someone is going to have to do it with the understanding we may not get it right. We will constantly revisit this. We will go back. We will tweak it, but someone has to do it. And we have to move it beyond just the conversations and just the people who are impacted, making it at the top of their priorities. Like, this should also be at the top of a national security priority list as well. This should be at the top of a law enforcement priority list. And then we're going to just do it.
So I'm looking at the clock and we're right a little past 11:30. So I'm gonna let everyone go, be free, be merry, digest this conversation. Nicole, thank you so much for being here, for sharing all of your wonderful thoughts with us.
Thank you so much. This was really great. I'm very excited about the Fellows program, and I'm happy that I was able to have this conversation with you.